A billionaire's autistic son cried nonstop on a plane for 90 agonizing minutes, and nothing could calm him. Then a little girl appeared with a wooden flute and whispered 5 words that made his father's blood run cold. "Your wife sent me here." She played one melody, and the screaming stopped. But that song had been buried 3 years ago with his dead wife, and no living person should know it. Before we dive into this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss what happens next, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from right now. Now, let's dive into the story. Ethan Vale had silenced entire boardrooms with a single glance. He'd stared down senators, crushed competitors, built 17 skyscrapers across 4 continents. But tonight, trapped in seat 2A of a transatlantic flight, he was being destroyed by his 7-year-old son. Leon's screams didn't sound human anymore. They came in waves that peaked and crashed, each one tearing through the first-class cabin like something feral trying to claw its way out. The boy's small body convulsed against the leather seat, fists hammering his father's chest, face gone purple-red, veins bulging at his temples. "Please, Leon. Please, buddy." Ethan's voice cracked. His hand, steady enough to sign billion-dollar contracts, trembled as they tried to cradle his son's head. Leon twisted away violently, and the screaming climbed higher, louder. A pitch that made passengers 3 rows back physically recoil. 47 minutes. That's how long they'd been airborne. 47 minutes of this hell suspended in the sky with nowhere to run. The flight attendant reappeared, her professional smile now a thin line of barely concealed panic. "Sir, perhaps if we could—" "I've tried everything." The words came out harsher than Ethan intended. He'd tried the weighted blanket the therapist recommended. The noise-canceling headphones cost $4,000. The sensory toys, the breathing exercises, the pressure points, every technique documented in every medical journal he'd paid specialists to summarize. None of it reached Leon. Nothing touched whatever storm raged inside his son's nervous system, turning a simple flight into torture. Across the aisle, a businessman in a gray suit folded his newspaper with deliberate slowness, his stare sharp as broken glass. Behind them, a woman's voice cut through. "Unbelievable. Should have booked a private jet if his kid can't handle public." Ethan's jaw locked so hard his teeth ached. These people had no idea. Leon wasn't throwing a tantrum. His autism made the world a weapon. Every hum of the engines, every shift in air pressure, every fluorescent light overhead became knives against his skin. The boy was drowning in sensations they couldn't even perceive, but explaining felt impossible when Leon's screams kept splitting reality in half. A phone camera appeared in his peripheral vision. Row 3C. A woman filming, probably already composing the caption, "Billionaire can't control his own kid." By morning, this would be everywhere. The headlines wrote themselves in Ethan's mind, each one a fresh humiliation. Leon's small fingers clawed at his seatbelt like it was strangling him. His breath came in ragged gasps between wails, chest heaving so violently Ethan feared he'd hyperventilate. How much crying could a child's body survive before something broke? "Leon, look at Daddy. Just look at me." Ethan tried to catch his son's gaze, but Leon's eyes skittered away, unfocused, lost in some private hell no one else could see. "Breathe with me. Remember how we practiced? In and out." But Leon couldn't hear him. Maybe Leon had never heard of him. Not really. Not the way Ethan needed him to. The thought landed like a fist to the sternum. How many times had Ethan convinced himself that his work mattered more? That building empires meant providing for Leon's future? He'd hired the best nannies, the top therapists, enrolled his son in programs that cost more than luxury cars. But when had he last sat on the floor and just existed beside Leon without checking his phone? When did presence matter more than profit? The cabin felt smaller suddenly, the recycled air too thin. Faces swam in Ethan's vision, some sympathetic, most disgusted, all of them watching his failure in real time. The businessman's glare said, "Control your kid." The woman with the phone said, "You don't deserve wealth." The flight attendant's tight smile said, "You're disrupting everyone." And maybe they were right. Maybe all his money, all his power, all the control he'd spent decades accumulating, maybe it meant absolutely nothing when the person who needed him most was suffering 2 feet away and he couldn't do a damn thing to stop it. Leon's scream hit a new register, so sharp that several passengers actually flinched. A man in row 4 stood up, face red. "This is ridiculous." "Sit down." Ethan's voice came out flat and dangerous. The man hesitated, then dropped back into his seat, but the victory felt hollow. He could still intimidate strangers, just not the one person who mattered. Time became meaningless. Minutes bled into each other, measured only by Leon's cries, and the burning in Ethan's arms from holding him, and the ache in his throat from staying calm when everything inside him was screaming too. His wife would have known what to do. Maya always knew. She'd had this gift, this ability to read Leon's invisible distress signals and respond before the meltdowns hit. She'd hum this lullaby, something she'd composed herself, and Leon would melt into her arms like she'd cast a spell. But Maya was gone. 3 years in the ground, and she'd taken all her magic with her. The lullaby was gone too. Ethan couldn't remember how it went anymore. He'd tried, especially in moments like this, but the melody slipped through his memory like water through fingers. Just another thing grief had stolen. Leon's body went rigid suddenly, back arching, a scream building that sounded different, deeper, more desperate. Panic flashed through Ethan. Was this still a meltdown or something worse? Should he call for an emergency landing? Could they even do that? "Please," he whispered, pulling Leon against his chest, even as the boy fought him. "Please, buddy. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to help you." The admission cracked something open inside him. All his life, Ethan had solutions. He'd never met a problem money or strategy couldn't solve. But this, his own son, he was useless. Then, through the noise, through Leon's cries and angry whispers and the steady, mechanical drone, Ethan heard something that made his spine straighten. Footsteps, small ones, light, deliberate. He looked up through exhaustion-blurred vision. A little girl stood in the aisle, 7, maybe 8 years old, dark hair in a messy braid, clothes that had seen better days. She had something tucked under one arm that looked like a teddy bear and something else in her hand. What stopped Ethan's breath wasn't her presence. It was her expression. She wasn't staring with pity or annoyance or fear. She was studying Leon with an intensity that seemed impossible for a child, like she was seeing past the screaming, past the chaos, into something deeper. Their eyes met, and in that fraction of a second, something passed between them that Ethan couldn't name. A recognition, an understanding, a wordless message that said, "I know something you don't." The girl took one step forward. The entire cabin held its breath. Even Leon's screaming faltered just for a heartbeat, just barely, as if some part of him sensed the shift in the air. Ethan's pulse hammered against his ribs. Who was this child? Why was she walking toward them? What did she think she could possibly do that trained professionals hadn't? But as she took another step, and another, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt since his wife died. Hope. Dangerous, fragile, impossible hope. And the terrifying certainty that whatever happened in the next 60 seconds would change everything. The cabin existed in two states simultaneously. Chaos surrounding a single point of eerie calm, like the eye of a hurricane, had taken the shape of a 7-year-old girl. Isla Rivers didn't ask permission to approach. Adults always asked permission, and permission always came with hesitation, with doubt, with the assumption that children understood less than they actually did. She'd learned early that sometimes you just moved, and the world rearranged itself around your certainty. Her bare feet made whisper sounds against the aircraft carpet. She'd kicked off her shoes 3 rows back because the buckles dug into her ankles, and her mother was asleep anyway, exhausted from the double shift at the diner before their flight. Nobody stopped Isla. The flight attendants stood frozen, mouths half open like actors who'd forgotten their lines. Leon's screaming continued, but Isla heard something underneath it that no one else seemed to notice, a pattern, a rhythm, almost musical in its desperation. Adults heard noise. She heard a language without words, the kind babies spoke before the world taught them to use sentences. Her fingers tightened around the wooden flute and the teddy bear she'd found at the donation center last week. The bear's remaining eye was a different color than the missing one, she could tell from the faded ring on the fabric. Someone had loved this bear hard enough to repair it multiple times, each stitch a different thread color, like a rainbow of broken promises sewn back together. She'd carried both items everywhere since finding them, driven by an instinct she couldn't articulate. They felt important, alive, almost. Like they were waiting for someone specific. "Sweetheart, you need to go back." The flight attendant's hand reached for Isla's shoulder. "Let her." Ethan's voice cut through, raw and desperate. He looked at Isla with eyes that had already surrendered to impossibility. What did he have left to lose? Pride had abandoned him somewhere over the Atlantic. Dignity had followed shortly after. Isla knelt beside Leon's seat with the careful slowness of someone approaching a wounded bird. Adults moved too fast, expected too much, demanded that broken things fix themselves immediately. She'd learned patience from watching her mother coax burnt pans back to gleaming, from planting seeds that took weeks to show green. Up close, Leon looked smaller than his screams suggested. His face was slick with tears and snot. Eyes squeezed shut so tightly his whole face had become a fist. But beneath the surface distress, Isla saw something else. Exhaustion so profound it made her own chest ache. This boy had been fighting for so long he'd forgotten what peace felt like. "He's not broken," she said, looking up at Ethan with the kind of directness that made adults uncomfortable. "He's just hearing too much." The words landed like a diagnosis from someone who actually understood. Ethan's breath caught audibly. In those 8 words, this stranger child had reached further than specialists, with decades of training and walls full of degrees. Isla placed the teddy bear on Leon's lap, right in the center of his thrashing field of vision. The movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial. The bear's patched eye seemed to catch the overhead light, creating the illusion that it was watching Leon back. Something shifted. Leon's fists froze mid-swing, hovering in the air like he'd hit an invisible wall. His screaming fractured, losing coherence, becoming something smaller and more confused. His eyes cracked open just slits at first, and found the bear. Have you ever watched someone recognize something they'd lost so long ago they'd forgotten they were missing it? That's what happened to Leon's face. The tension didn't leave entirely, but it transformed from terror into bewildered wonder. Isla didn't speak, didn't offer explanations or false comfort, or any of the meaningless sounds adults made when they wanted you to feel better without actually changing anything. Instead, she raised the wooden flute to her lips. The first note emerged like light breaking through storm clouds, pure, crystalline, impossible to ignore. It hung in the recycled cabin air for exactly 2 heartbeats before the second note joined it, and then the third, building into a melody that felt older than the plane, older than the people, maybe older than memory itself. The businessman's newspaper slipped from his fingers. The woman recording lowered her phone without realizing she'd done it. Even the engine seemed to quiet, though that was impossible. The machines don't respond to music. But perception shifted, and in the space where rage and judgment had lived, something softer grew. Leon's screaming stopped. Not gradually, not in stages. It simply ended, like someone had cut the cord connecting his distress to his voice. His mouth hung open mid-wail, breath suspended. Eyes locked onto Isla with an intensity that bordered on religious experience. The melody wasn't complex. A simple ascending line that curved back on itself, rose again, then settled into resolution. But simplicity carried its own power. This wasn't showing off. This was communication stripped to its purest form. Isla played 12 measures in total. Each note landed with surgical precision in the exact space where chaos had lived seconds before, displacing it molecule by molecule until nothing remained but stillness and the fading echo of something beautiful. When the final note dissolved into silence, the absence of sound felt louder than the screaming had been. Leon reached for the teddy bear with trembling fingers, pulled it against his chest like a shield or a life raft, and closed his eyes. His breathing evened out. His clenched fists opened, palms up, surrendering. The storm passed. Ethan couldn't move, couldn't process, could only stare at this impossible child who'd accomplished in 90 seconds what he'd failed to manage in 90 minutes of increasingly desperate attempts. His throat closed around words that felt too small for what had just happened. How? His voice came out crushed, barely functional. How did you know? Isla lowered the flute, studied it like she was surprised to find it in her hands, like it had acted independently and she'd just been the vessel. My mom says music is just feelings that forget how to use words. She glanced at Leon, who clutched the bear tighter with each breath. He was feeling too much. I gave his feelings somewhere else to go. The logic shouldn't have worked. It violated everything Ethan understood about autism and sensory overload and evidence-based interventions. But watching Leon rest truly rested, muscles slack, features peaceful, he couldn't argue with results. Where did you learn that song? The question emerged before Ethan could consider whether he wanted the answer. Isla's shoulders lifted in a small shrug. I didn't learn it. The flute already knew. I just asked nicely, and it remembered. The answer made no sense. Flutes didn't remember. Objects didn't carry memory. But Ethan's pulse kicked faster anyway, because somewhere in the back of his mind, something stirred a half-buried recognition he couldn't quite reach. Isla stood, preparing to leave, and panic flashed through Ethan. Wait. She paused, looked back with those eyes that seemed too ancient for her small face. What's your name? Isla. Thank you, Isla. The words felt criminally inadequate. She'd given him back his son. How did you thank someone for that? But before he could try, Isla leaned close to Leon's sleeping form and whispered something that would haunt Ethan Vale for the rest of his life. It's okay now. He remembered who loves him. The sentence landed like a physical blow. Leon's lips curved upward, barely perceptible, but unmistakably a smile. The first genuine smile Ethan had seen in months. Isla stepped back into the aisle, and only then did Ethan realize the bear was with Leon now. When had she let go of it? He'd been watching the entire time, but somehow the transfer had happened in a gap his attention couldn't track. She padded away, disappearing back into the economy section. And the cabin slowly remembered how to breathe. Passengers exchanged glances but didn't speak, like acknowledging what they'd witnessed might break whatever spell had been cast. Ethan looked down at his sleeping son. Really looked. Leon's features had gone soft, the bear tucked under his chin, one small hand curled around its worn fur. Peace had replaced anguish so completely it seemed impossible they'd occupied the same body minutes ago. And then Ethan's brain caught up to what his subconscious had been screaming since the first note. That melody. Those specific notes in that specific sequence. His blood turned to ice water. He knew that song. He knew it the way you know your own heartbeat, so familiar it had become invisible until suddenly it wasn't. Lullaby for Sky, his wife's composition. Maya used to play it every night when Leon was a baby, humming it while she rocked him to sleep, her fingers dancing across their old piano keys. She'd called it their family song, something that belonged only to them. She died before she could teach it to anyone else. The sheet music had been buried with her at her request, tucked into her coffin like a secret she'd taken to the grave. So how did a random child on a plane know his dead wife's lullaby? Ethan's hands started shaking before his mind fully understood why. The melody looped in his skull, each note precise and devastating, unearthing memories he'd buried under 3 years of deliberately constructed numbness. Maya, at the piano bench, pregnant belly pressing against the keys, humming that exact sequence, while sunlight cut through their living room windows. Maya, in the hospital, exhausted and radiant, playing the lullaby on her phone because she'd forgotten the sheet music. Maya in Leon's nursery at 2 in the morning, her voice cracked from exhaustion, but still finding those notes, still wrapping their son in sound like a blanket woven from love itself. The lullaby had died with her. Ethan had made certain of that. He'd deleted every recording, destroyed every piece of sheet music except the copy they'd buried with her body. The song hurt too much to keep alive, each note a reminder of everything he'd lost, everything Leon would grow up without. So how did it survive? How had it traveled from his dead wife's grave into the hands of a 7-year-old stranger 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean? His lungs forgot how to process air. The cabin walls pressed inward. Or maybe his chest was collapsing, he couldn't tell which. Leon slept peacefully beside him, the teddy bear clutched tight, completely unaware that reality had just fractured in ways that violated every law of rational thought. Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt with numb fingers. He needed answers. Needed them more than he'd ever needed a business deal to close or a competitor to fall. This wasn't about money or power. This was about the fundamental architecture of his universe, and someone had just revealed it was built on sand. The flight attendant materialized beside him like she'd been waiting. "Sir, the seatbelt sign is—" "Watch him." Ethan stood before she could finish, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made people obey without understanding why. "If he wakes up, come get me immediately." "It'll be 2 minutes." He moved down the aisle before she could protest, past the businessman who'd glared earlier, past the woman who'd been filming, past rows of passengers who tracked his movement with expressions caught between curiosity and concern. Nobody stopped him. The desperation rolling off him in waves made intervention feel dangerous. Economy class stretched before him like a different country. Narrower seats, dimmer lights, the smell of too many bodies sharing too little space. Ethan had forgotten what this section felt like. He'd spent the last decade insulated by first-class curtains and private jets, as if wealth could build walls high enough to keep out ordinary human experience. He found Isla 3 rows from the rear galley. She sat wedged between an empty seat and a woman who had to be her mother, same dark hair, same angular cheekbones, but with exhaustion carved so deep into her features it looked like a permanent condition. The mother slept hard, head tilted at an angle that would leave her neck screaming later, mouth slightly open. Working-class sleep, Ethan recognized. The kind that happened because your body finally overrode your mind's protests. Isla wasn't sleeping. She stared out the window at darkness punctuated by the plane's blinking wing lights, the wooden flute resting across her lap like a sword laid down after battle. Isla. Her name came out rougher than Ethan intended. She turned, unsurprised, as if she'd been expecting him. Is Leon okay? The question hit him sideways. She'd performed a miracle, and her first concern was whether it had lasted. He's sleeping. Because of you. Ethan crouched in the aisle to meet her eye level, aware of how ridiculous he must look like a billionaire in a custom suit, folding himself into cramped economy space. I need to know where you learned that song. Isla's fingers traced the flute's worn surface, following grooves that spoke of years of use by hands that weren't hers. I told you, the flute remembered it. Flutes don't remember. The words came out harsher than intended. Someone taught you. Someone showed you the notes. Who was it? Nobody. No defensiveness in her voice, just simple fact. I found the flute at St. Catherine's Donation Center last Tuesday. It was in a box with this. She gestured vaguely toward the front of the plane, where Leon slept with the bear. And some other stuff. When I picked it up, my fingers just knew where to go. Like the song was hiding inside the wood, waiting for someone to ask it to come out. Ethan's jaw clenched hard enough to make his teeth ache. She was a child, probably prone to magical thinking, conflating coincidence with destiny. But the melody was too precise. Those weren't random notes stumbled upon by lucky accident. They were Maya's composition, her specific arrangement, the way she'd voiced the harmony in the third measure that deviated from conventional structure. St. Catherine's. He forced his voice level. On Morrison Avenue? Isla nodded. That was Maya's foundation. The charity she'd started before Leon was born, the one Ethan had kept running after her death because shutting it down felt like killing her twice. They collected donations of clothes, furniture, instruments, whatever people wanted to give, and redistributed them to families who needed help. His heart hammered against his ribs. The teddy bear, the one you gave Leon, where did it come from? Same box. What else was in there? Isla's brow furrowed in concentration. A blue scarf, some sheet music with coffee stains, a picture frame, but the glass was cracked so they probably threw it away. And a letter, I think, but I can't read cursive yet, so I don't know what it said. The air left Ethan's lungs in a rush. Blue scarf Maya had worn one constantly during her pregnancy, claiming it was the only thing that didn't make her nauseous. Sheet music with coffee stains she'd composed at their kitchen table every morning, always spilling her drink. Picture frame they'd had dozens throughout the house before he'd packed everything away. These weren't random donations. This was Maya's life, boxed up and distributed to strangers because Ethan couldn't stand having her belongings around anymore, couldn't survive the constant reminders that she'd existed and then stopped. He'd donated everything 2 years ago in a single purging weekend, hadn't even looked through the boxes, just needed it gone. The Foundation's warehouse had received 17 boxes of his late wife's possessions, and Ethan had never asked what happened to them after that. Now those possessions have come back, not to him, but to his son, delivered by a child who couldn't possibly understand the magnitude of what she carried. The flute. His voice came out strangled. Let me see it. Isla hesitated, fingers tightening around the wood. Possessiveness flashed across her face, the instinctive territoriality of children who'd learned that good things usually got taken away. But something in Ethan's expression must have convinced her, because she slowly extended the instrument toward him. The moment his fingers touched it, Ethan knew. The weight, the balance, the specific wear pattern on the mouthpiece. This was Maya's flute, the one she'd played in college, before medical school, back when she'd dreamed of being a musician instead of a doctor. She'd kept it on a shelf in their bedroom, would take it down occasionally and play when she couldn't sleep, filling their house with melodies that made Ethan feel like he was living inside something sacred. He'd donated this, thrown it in a box with her other instruments, couldn't bear seeing it collect dust while its owner rotted underground. His hands trembled so violently he almost dropped the flute. The wood felt warm, impossibly warm, like it had been held recently by someone with a living pulse. Ethan raised it to his lips without thinking, tried to find the notes of Lullaby for Sky, but his breath came out shaky and discordant, producing only broken sounds that hurt to hear. He couldn't play it, had never been able to. Music was Maya's language, not his. But this child, this stranger with worn sneakers and clothes that had been washed too many times, she'd picked up his dead wife's flute and somehow channeled a melody that existed nowhere except in Ethan's grief-soaked memories. How? The question barely made it past his throat. How did you know which notes to play? Isla reached out and gently took the flute back, cradling it with the reverence of someone holding something alive. I didn't know. I just felt them. Like when you're sad and you don't know why, but your body knows something your brain hasn't figured out yet. She looked up at him with those two old eyes. The flute was sad, really, really sad, so I asked what would make me happy, and it showed me. Impossible. All of it is impossible. Objects didn't feel emotion. Melodies didn't transmit across time and death. Children didn't receive psychic downloads from second-hand instruments. But Leon was sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. That was real, undeniable. Whatever impossible thing had happened, it had worked. Ethan became aware of passengers watching, curious and concerned. He'd been crouched in the aisle too long, blocking foot traffic, invading this child's space with the intensity of someone unraveling. I'm sorry. He stood, knees protesting, suddenly feeling every one of his 43 years. I didn't mean to. Thank you. For helping my son. You gave him something I couldn't. Isla tilted her head, studying him with that unnerving directness. You miss her. The observation landed like a physical blow. What? The person who used to play this. She lifted the flute slightly. You miss her so much, it made you forget how to hear music. That's why you couldn't remember the song. Your ears work fine, but your heart stopped listening. How did she know that? How could a 7-year-old articulate what Ethan's therapist had failed to identify after 18 months of weekly sessions? Before he could respond, Isla's mother stirred, eyelids fluttering. Ethan stepped back instinctively, suddenly aware of how this looked like a strange man hovering over someone's sleeping child. I should get back to Leon. The words came out mechanical. His brain was still trying to process revelations too large to fit inside rational frameworks. Isla nodded. He'll sleep now. The song reminded him he's not alone. Ethan walked back to first class in a daze, past the staring passengers, past the concerned flight attendant, back to where Leon slept, curled around a teddy bear that used to sit on Maya's side of their bed. He collapsed into his seat and stared at his son's peaceful face. The universe had just sent him a message written in his dead wife's handwriting, delivered by a stranger child who'd found fragments of Maya's life in a donation bin, and somehow reconstructed them into the exact medicine Leon needed. Coincidence didn't stretch that far. This was something else, something that made Ethan's hands shake and his carefully constructed atheism crack down the middle. What if Maya hadn't left them completely? What if love didn't end just because the person carrying it stopped breathing? The question terrified him more than any business risk he'd ever taken. Because if it was true, it meant he'd been wrong about everything for 3 years. And if he'd been wrong about that, what else had he gotten catastrophically, irreversibly wrong? Ethan sat motionless in seat 2A, while the aircraft hummed through darkness, his mind performing calculations that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the fundamental structure of reality. 3 years ago, he'd donated 17 boxes to St. Catherine's Foundation without opening a single one. He'd hired movers to pack Maya's belongings while he locked himself in his office and drowned in bourbon, unable to watch her existence get reduced to cardboard and tape. The grief counselor had called it necessary separation from trauma triggers. Ethan had called it survival. Now he recognized it for what it actually was: cowardice dressed in therapeutic language. Those 17 boxes had contained fragments of a life he'd loved and lost. Her medical textbooks with handwritten margin notes, her collection of vintage flutes, the blue scarf she'd worn until it frayed, photographs he couldn't bear to see, instruments she'd played, sheet music she'd composed in the early morning hours when Leon's crying kept them both awake. Somewhere in that donation, in a box number unknown, processed by warehouse staff he'd never met, Maya's wooden flute and Leon's childhood teddy bear had ended up together. Random chances should have scattered them to different families across the city. Probability said they'd never occupy the same space again. But they had. In the hands of a 7-year-old girl who happened to board the same transatlantic flight where Leon happened to have his worst meltdown in months. Ethan's business empire was built on pattern recognition, on identifying connections others missed. This wasn't a pattern. This was orchestration. The universe didn't arrange coincidences with this kind of surgical precision unless something larger was directing traffic. Leon shifted in his sleep, small fingers tightening around the teddy bear's worn fur, and Ethan noticed something he'd missed before. The bear's remaining eye wasn't original. Someone had replaced it recently, judging by the clean stitching. But the color was wrong. The original eyes had been black plastic. This one was brown fabric, slightly too large, giving the bear a lopsided appearance that was somehow more endearing than the symmetrical version Maya had first bought. She'd purchased that bear the day they found out she was pregnant. Ethan remembered because she'd cried in the store, overwhelmed by sudden terror that she wouldn't be good enough, that she'd fail this tiny person who hadn't even been born yet. He'd held her between aisles of baby supplies and promised her she'd be extraordinary. And she had been. For 7 years, Maya had been the kind of mother who made other parents question whether they were doing enough. Then her heart stopped during a routine surgery, a congenital defect nobody knew existed. She'd gone under anesthesia and simply never woken up. The doctors used words like unpredictable and unpreventable, but those terms meant nothing to a 7-year-old boy who kept asking when mommy was coming home. Ethan had kept the bear for 6 months after her death, watching Leon drag it everywhere, the fabric slowly absorbing a child's grief. Then one eye had fallen off during a particularly violent meltdown, and Ethan, in a moment of rage at the universe's cruelty, had thrown the entire thing in a donation box. Another piece of Maya, erased, another reminder, eliminated. Yet here it was, repaired by unknown hands, returned to Leon through a chain of events that felt less like chance and more like intention. The flight attendant passed by, noticed Ethan staring at his sleeping son with an expression that probably looked unhinged, and wisely kept moving. Smart woman. Ethan wasn't certain he could form coherent sentences if she'd asked whether he needed anything. What he needed existed outside the scope of airline service protocols. He pulled out his phone, switched it to airplane mode, and scrolled through old photos he'd avoided for 3 years. There Maya is 32 weeks pregnant, laughing at something off camera, her hands resting on her belly. There Maya is in the hospital, holding newborn Leon, exhausted and transcendent. There Maya at their piano, fingers on keys, her expression distant and focused, as she worked through a composition. Lullaby for Sky. She'd finished it 2 months before Leon was born, played it at his baby shower, cried halfway through because pregnancy hormones made everything feel like the end of the world. Ethan had recorded it on his phone, just 30 seconds of shaky video with terrible audio quality. He'd watched that clip 700 times in the month after she died, then deleted it because the pain of hearing her play had become indistinguishable from dying. But the melody survived anyway, somehow, in wood and strings and the mysterious channels through which love apparently traveled when given no other choice. Isla had played it perfectly, not approximately, not close enough, perfectly. Every note in the right order, every pause precisely where Maya had placed it, the slight acceleration in the third measure that gave the lullaby its emotional urgency. That wasn't intuition. That wasn't a lucky guess. That was transmission. As if Maya had encoded herself into the flute's grain, waiting for the right person to activate the message. Ethan's rationalist brain screamed that he was constructing fantasy from coincidence, building meaning from randomness, because humans couldn't tolerate the idea that the universe operated without purpose. But another part of him, the part that had fallen in love with a woman who believed in magic disguised as medicine, wondered whether Maya had found a way to reach through death and remind him that love didn't stop just because breathing did. The question felt too large to hold. If Maya could still influence events, still guide outcomes, still protect Leon from 30,000 feet underground, then everything Ethan understood about endings was wrong. Death wasn't a termination, it was a transformation, and grief wasn't the process of letting go. It was the process of learning a new language for connection. Leon sighed in his sleep, a sound so peaceful it made Ethan's chest physically hurt. When was the last time his son had looked this calm? Weeks? Months? Ethan had stopped tracking, overwhelmed by the relentless accumulation of difficult moments that defined their life together. One melody had changed that. 12 measures played by a stranger with second-hand instruments that used to belong to his dead wife. Ethan looked toward the rear of the plane, where Isla sat in economy class holding a flute she couldn't possibly understand the significance of. That child had given him something worth more than his entire fortune, proof that Leon could still experience peace, still access joy, still connect with the mother he barely remembered, and proof that maybe, just maybe, Maya was still mothering from whatever place people went when their bodies stopped working. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like the first deep breath he'd taken in 3 years. Outside the window, stars scattered across infinity, and for the first time since Maya died, Ethan Vale allowed himself to believe that some connections survived even that vast darkness. Dawn broke over the Atlantic in shades of gold that looked like liquid metal poured across water. And Leon opened his eyes for the first time in 8 hours without screaming. Ethan watched the transformation happen in real time, his son's eyelids fluttering, pupils adjusting to cabin light that should have triggered immediate sensory assault, small body stretching without the violent rigidity that usually accompanied waking. Leon blinked slowly, focused on the teddy bear still clutched against his chest, and something remarkable happened to his face. He smiled, not the empty reflex that sometimes crossed his features, not the response therapists had trained into him through months of behavioral conditioning. This was genuine recognition, the kind that came from somewhere deeper than learned behavior from memory, maybe, or instinct, or whatever part of the human soul knew it was loved even when language failed. Leon lifted the bear to eye level, studying its mismatched eyes with the intense concentration he usually reserved for lining up toys in perfect rows. His fingers traced the rainbow of stitches holding it together, each thread a different color, each repairing a small act of devotion from whoever had refused to let this object die. Mama. The word came out so softly, Ethan almost missed it. His heart stopped. Actually stopped. Leon hadn't said that word in 2 years. The therapists claimed he'd forgotten it, that his language regression had erased nouns for people he no longer saw. Ethan had accepted that explanation because accepting felt easier than hoping. But now, his son held a teddy bear that used to belong to his dead mother and spoke her name like he'd been saying it every day in some private interior space where Ethan couldn't follow. Yes, buddy. Ethan's voice came out wrecked. That was Mama's. She loved you so much. Leon turned to look at him with direct eye contact, another impossibility his therapists said happened rarely and without predictable triggers. The boy's expression held something Ethan had never seen there before: clarity. As if the fog that usually separated Leon from the world had temporarily lifted, granting him access to understanding that existed beyond his neurological limitations. Music, Leon said, still holding the bear. She made music. Tears burned behind Ethan's eyes. How did Leon remember that? He'd been 4 when Maya died. Barely verbal even then, his autism already building walls between him and conventional memory. Yet somehow he'd retained this specific truth that his mother had created melodies, had filled their home with sound that transcended language. She did, Leon. She made beautiful music. And last night, a little girl played one of Mama's songs for you. Did you hear it? Leon nodded, a single deliberate movement. She said... He paused, struggling to organize words that didn't come naturally. She said, I remember. Remember what? Leon pressed the bear tighter against his chest, his face scrunching with the effort of translating interior experience into external language. Who loves me? The sentence hit Ethan like a physical force. He'd spent 3 years showing Leon love through action, providing therapy, ensuring safety, maintaining routine. But had he ever made his son feel loved? Had Leon spent these years isolated not just by autism, but by the suspicion that affection had died with his mother? Children know things adults forget. They sense emotional weather systems invisible to grown-up perception. Leon had been living in Ethan's house of grief, surrounded by a father who'd stopped playing music, stopped laughing, and stopped believing that joy could exist in a universe cruel enough to take Maya. What had that atmosphere taught his son about whether love survived loss? I love you. Ethan said it with an urgency that surprised him. I love you more than anything in this world. You know that, right? Leon's eyes drifted back to the bear, and for a terrible moment, Ethan thought he'd lost him again, that the brief window of connection had closed. But then Leon spoke again, quieter this time, words emerging like secrets. The girl said Mama sent her. Ice water flooded Ethan's veins. What? When she gave me this. Leon lifted the bear slightly. She whispered, said Mama wanted me to have it back, said Mama still sings, just different now. Ethan's hands started trembling. He hadn't heard that exchange, hadn't seen Isla whisper anything, but he'd been in shock, overwhelmed by his son's sudden peace, not tracking the specific mechanics of how that peace had been delivered. Has Isla actually said that? Or had Leon's mind, desperate for maternal comfort, constructed a narrative that made the impossible feel purposeful? It didn't matter. What mattered was the effect Leon believed his mother was still present somehow, still protecting him, still loving him across whatever boundary separated living from dead. That belief had given him something Ethan's money and desperate attempts at parenting never could: the certainty that he wasn't abandoned. Maybe she did send her, Ethan heard himself say, shocking his own rational mind. Maybe Mama found a way to help you when you needed it most. Leon considered this seriously, his face taking on the solemn expression of someone processing profound theological implications. Then, with the devastating simplicity only children possess, he said, "Okay." Just like that, no need for proof or logical explanation. His mother loved him, therefore the universe would arrange itself to demonstrate that love. The equation was complete. Ethan wanted that kind of faith. Wanted to believe with the uncomplicated certainty of a 7-year-old that death was porous, that love leaked through, that Maya was somehow still mothering from whatever came after. His adult brain resisted, clinging to materialism, but his heart, his exhausted, grief-shattered heart, was ready to surrender to possibilities larger than reason. The seatbelt sign chimed off. Around them, passengers stirred, stretching, gathering belongings, preparing for landing. Normal people doing normal things, unaware they'd witnessed something that rewrote the rules about what ended and what continued. Leon kept holding the bear, kept smiling that small, private smile, and Ethan realized with absolute clarity that something fundamental had shifted, not just in his son, but in the architecture of their relationship. They'd been living parallel lives in the same house, Ethan in his grief, Leon in his isolation, connected by biology, but separated by walls neither knew how to breach. Now those walls had cracks. Light was getting through, and the light looked suspiciously like a melody played by a child who'd found fragments of Maya's life and somehow knew exactly what to do with them. The plane began its descent, and Ethan felt the pull of gravity returning them to Earth. But part of him remained suspended in the revelation of the last 8 hours, hovering in the space between what he'd believed was true and what might actually be real. His son remembered who loved him. That was a miracle. Everything else was just the delivery system. The plane touched down at 6:47 a.m., and Ethan Vale, who'd spent 15 years building a reputation for being 3 steps ahead of everyone, realized he'd been moving through life completely blind. Passengers flooded the aisles with their standard post-flight urgency, wrestling luggage from overhead bins, checking phones that had been dormant for 8 hours, returning to the comfortable fiction that they controlled their destinies. Ethan remained seated, Leon beside him still clutching the bear, both of them existing in a pocket of stillness while chaos swirled around them. He needed to see Isla again, needed to understand the mechanics of what had happened, even if understanding proved impossible. His entire identity was built on causation, on tracing effects back to their origins and mastering the variables. This situation violated every principle he'd operated under. But that didn't mean patterns didn't exist, just that he'd been looking at the wrong data points. "Stay close to me," Ethan said, helping Leon out of his seat. His son moved with unusual cooperation, no resistance, no meltdown at the transition. The bear remained pressed against his chest, like a talisman warding off the sensory assault of deplaning. They joined the shuffle toward the exit, Ethan scanning faces for Isla and her mother. Economy passengers would take longer to disembark. That was the architecture of air travel. First class always got first exit, but he could wait at the gate, intercept them before they disappeared into the terminal and out of his life forever. The flight attendant who'd watched Leon's meltdown stood at the aircraft door, offering mechanical smiles to departing passengers. When Ethan reached her, he stopped. The little girl from the economy, dark hair, maybe 7 years old. She was traveling with her mother. "Do you know if they've developed yet?" The attendant's professional mask flickered with something human surprise, maybe, or curiosity, about why a billionaire was asking about passengers from the cheap seats. "I'm not sure, sir, but they'd still be waiting to exit. You could—" "I'll wait." Ethan moved into the jetway, Leon beside him, positioning himself where he could watch passengers emerge. The flight crew gave him odd looks but didn't challenge him. Money bought a lot of things, including the right to behave strangely without immediate intervention. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Ethan's pulse climbed with each group of passengers that wasn't them. What if they'd gotten off through a different exit? What if they'd moved faster than he'd calculated? What if this was a single night of impossible intervention, and then nothing, no follow-up, no explanation, just a returned gift from his dead wife delivered by a stranger who'd evaporate back into anonymous urban sprawl? Then he saw her. Isla emerged from the aircraft holding her mother's hand, the wooden flute tucked under her other arm, moving with the sleepy shuffle of a child who'd been awake too long. Her mother looked even more exhausted in daylight, face drawn, shoulders curved inward like she'd spent years expecting the world to hit her and was trying to present a smaller target. Isla. Ethan stepped forward, Leon's hand tight in his. The girl stopped, looked up, and smiled small and knowing, like she'd expected this meeting. Her mother's head snapped toward Ethan with the immediate wariness of someone who'd learned to distrust men who knew her daughter's name. "I'm sorry," Ethan said quickly, reading the fear in the mother's eyes. "I'm not. We met on the flight. Isla helped my son. I just wanted to thank her properly." The mother's expression didn't soften much, but her grip on Isla's hand loosened slightly. "How did you help? How did you explain miracles to someone who looked like they'd stopped believing in them years ago?" "My son has autism. He was having a severe episode. Your daughter played a song on her flute, and he calmed down. She gave him this bear, and it stopped everything." The mother glanced down at Isla with surprise, like this was new information. "You did that?" Isla shrugged, suddenly shy. He was sad. "The music helped." Ethan crouched to Isla's eye level again, aware of terminal crowds flowing around them, of time compressing. "The flute you have, and the bear you gave Leon. Do you remember anything else about them? Anything about where they came from before the donation center?" Isla's brow furrowed. There was a card in the box. It had a name on it. Ethan's heart kicked. "What name?" "Veil. I remember because it sounded like veil, like what brides wear, and I thought that was pretty." The terminal tilted. Ethan grabbed the wall to steady himself. Veil. His name. Maya's married name. The donations hadn't been anonymous. The foundation tracked major contributors, sent tax receipts. Every box he'd dumped that terrible weekend had been logged under his account, tagged with his identity, marked as belonging to a family whose structure had collapsed. "The card," Ethan pushed, voice urgent. "Do you still have it?" Isla shook her head. "It fell out when I took the flute. Might still be at the center." Her mother was watching this exchange with growing confusion and concern. "I don't understand what's happening." Ethan stood, forced himself to slow down, to remember that to this woman he was still a stranger, making cryptic demands. "My wife died 3 years ago. I donated her belongings to St. Catherine's Foundation, including that flute and that bear. They were deeply personal items. The fact that your daughter found them, that she was on this specific flight, that she knew how to play a song my wife composed." He trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence without sounding unhinged. The mother's expression shifted, still wary, but now mixed with something else. Pity, maybe, or recognition of shared grief. "I'm sorry for your loss." The platitude landed flat, but Ethan appreciated the attempt. "The song Isla played, Lullaby for Sky, my wife wrote for Leon when he was a baby. Nobody else knew it. The sheet music was buried with her, but somehow your daughter played it perfectly." Isla looked up at him with those ancient eyes. "I told you. The flute remembered." Her mother frowned. "Isla, honey, that's not—" "It's true, Mama." No defensiveness, just certainty. Flutes hold songs the same way people hold memories, You just have to ask them to share." The mother started to protest, then stopped, seeming to recognize that arguing would accomplish nothing. She turned to Ethan instead. "My daughter has an active imagination. I'm sure there's a logical explanation." "There isn't." Ethan said it with enough conviction to make her pause. "I've built my entire life on logical explanations. This doesn't have one, which means either I'm losing my mind or the universe operates on rules I don't understand." A long moment of silence. Terminal announcements echoed overhead. Passengers rushed past, the ordinary machinery of travel continuing around them, while they stood suspended in extraordinary territory. Finally, the mother spoke. "We need to catch our connection, but—" She pulled a pen from her purse, grabbed Ethan's hand, and wrote a phone number on his palm. "If you want to talk more about this, call me. I'm Tessa, by the way. Tessa Rivers." Ethan Vale. He stared at the numbers on his skin like they were sacred text. "Thank you for raising someone who sees things others miss." Tessa's face softened fractionally. "She's always been different, notices patterns, hears things that aren't there or maybe things that are there and the rest of us are too busy to hear. Her teachers think she's strange. I think she's perfect." Isla hugged her mother's leg, and the gesture was so ordinary, so simply loving, that Ethan felt his throat close. This was what parenting could look like when you weren't constantly fighting invisible wars against neurological conditions and grief. Leon stepped forward suddenly, holding out the teddy bear. Ethan's pulse spiked. No, not that Leon needed the bear, but his son wasn't offering it back. He was showing it to Isla, presenting it for approval, making sure she saw that he was taking care of what she'd given him. "Thank you," Leon said, the words slow but clear, "for Mama's song." Isla smiled, reached out, and gently touched the bear's repaired eye. "You're welcome. She wanted you to have it." Then she turned to her mother, said, "We can go now," and the two of them walked toward their gate, disappearing into the flow of travelers like they'd never been there at all. Ethan stood frozen, Leon beside him, both of them holding pieces of Maya that had somehow found their way home. Around them, life continued announcements, rolling luggage, coffee-seeking zombies, but Ethan existed outside that rhythm now, operating on a different frequency. The universe had just shown him its hand. Every item in those 17 donated boxes had been logged, labeled, distributed through a system he'd never bothered to understand. Somewhere in St. Catherine's database, there was a record of exactly where each piece of Maya had gone, which families received her books, which homes now contained her instruments, who'd inherited fragments of her life without knowing they'd touched someone's entire world. And among those fragments, among the random distribution of a dead woman's possessions, 2 items had ended up with a child who'd board the same flight where her son would desperately need them. Probability didn't work like that. Chance didn't orchestrate with such precision, which meant something else was at work, something that used donation centers and airline schedules and a 7-year-old's inexplicable musical intuition to deliver a message Ethan had spent 3 years refusing to hear. Love doesn't end. It just finds new ways to reach you. His phone buzzed, text messages flooding in now that they'd landed, the business world demanding his attention. But for the first time in his professional life, Ethan didn't care. Let the meetings wait. Let the deals stall. He had a foundation database to search and a dead wife's trail to follow, because Maya had apparently been leaving him breadcrumbs and he'd been too blind to see them. Leon tugged his hand. "Home now?" Ethan looked down at his son, at this small person who'd remembered love despite every reason to forget it, and felt something crack open in his chest. Not breaking. Opening. Like a door sealed for years finally admitting light. "Yeah, buddy. Home now. But first, we have some detective work to do. Leon's eyes lit up with curiosity, and Ethan realized with sudden clarity that this was only the beginning. The baggage claim carousel spun in hypnotic circles, luggage tumbling onto the conveyor like offerings from some mechanical god. But Ethan couldn't focus on any of it. His mind was still 30,000 feet in the air, replaying the last 8 hours frame by frame, searching for the moment when reality had shifted from material to mystical. Leon sat on the floor beside him, cross-legged, the teddy bear positioned carefully in his lap. He was humming, barely audible, more breath than sound, but Ethan recognized the melody immediately. Lullaby for Sky. His son was reproducing Maya's composition from memory after hearing it once, his damaged neural pathways somehow capturing what Ethan's intact ones had lost years ago. How did autism work that it could steal language but preserve music? How did a brain that struggled with eye contact and conversation retain perfect pitch and melodic structure? The specialists had explained it once using terms like splinter skills and savant abilities, but those labels felt like admissions of ignorance dressed in professional vocabulary. Nobody understood Leon's mind. They just measured its deficits and tried to make him more normal. But what if normal wasn't the goal? What if Leon's different wiring made him capable of receiving signals typical brains filtered out as noise? What if his son had been hearing Maya all along and simply lacked the language to report it? The thought made Ethan's hands shake. He'd spent 3 years treating Leon's autism as an obstacle to overcome, a condition to manage, a barrier between his son and the world. But maybe it was also a kind of antenna, tuned to frequencies Ethan's rational mind couldn't access. Their luggage appeared, designer bags that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and Ethan mechanically loaded them onto a cart. Leon stood without prompting, kept humming, and followed his father toward ground transportation. The cooperation was unprecedented. Usually, airports triggered sensory overload that lasted for days. But today, Leon moved through the chaos like he was protected by something invisible, some force field generated by the bear in his arms and the melody in his throat. The town car Ethan had arranged sat waiting at the curb, driver holding a sign with his name. They settled into leather seats that smelled like expensive detailing, and the city swallowed them highways and exits, buildings and billboards, the familiar landscape of wealth and power that suddenly felt utterly meaningless. "Where to, Mr. Vale?" The driver's voice crackled through the intercom. Ethan almost said home, almost retreated to the penthouse where he'd spent 3 years hiding from grief behind floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist furniture. But his mouth produced different words. St. Catherine's Foundation, the main distribution center on Morrison Avenue. The driver's pause suggested confusion. That wasn't a typical destination for someone wearing a suit that cost 5 figures, but he didn't question it. Money bought obedience to eccentric requests. They drove through morning traffic, past coffee shops filled with commuters, past construction sites and bus stops, and the intricate choreography of a city waking up. Ethan watched it all through tinted windows, feeling weirdly detached, like he was observing a species he'd once belonged to, but no longer understood. Leon had stopped humming. He stared out his window with unusual focus, tracking something Ethan couldn't see. "Mama's house," he said suddenly. Ethan's pulse kicked. "What, buddy?" "We're going to Mama's house." Leon pressed one small hand against the glass. "Where she keeps her things." The statement landed with eerie accuracy. Maya had founded St. Catherine's, had spent hundreds of hours at that warehouse sorting donations and organizing distributions. She'd called it her second home, the place where her medical training and her desire to help people intersected. Leon had been too young to remember visiting, had been barely 4 when Maya died, yet somehow he knew exactly where they were headed. Or maybe he didn't know. Maybe he was just guessing, making connections that felt true even if they weren't. Ethan's scientist brain wanted to dismiss it as coincidence, but his scientist brain was losing arguments lately. The warehouse appeared after 20 minutes, a converted industrial building with Maya's name still etched on the cornerstone. Vale Foundation for Community Support, Est 2019. Ethan had funded it, but Maya had built it, turning abstract charitable impulses into concrete systems for redistributing wealth from those who had too much to those who had too little. He'd avoided this place since her death, kept paying the operational costs, kept the staff employed, but never set foot inside. Too many memories embedded in the concrete. Too many reminders that she'd believed in human goodness, and he'd stopped believing in anything except survival. Now he was here, led by a chain of impossible events, searching for answers in a database of donated objects. The driver pulled up to the entrance. "Should I wait, sir?" "Yes." Ethan helped Leon out of the car, both of them standing before the building like it was a temple requiring specific rituals of entry. The teddy bear hung from Leon's hand, dragging on the pavement, accumulating city dirt on its already worn fur. Inside, the warehouse stretched vast and organized shelves of clothing sorted by size, furniture arranged by function, boxes of books and dishes and electronics waiting for families who needed them. Volunteers moved through the space with practiced efficiency, and for a moment, Ethan felt intensely embarrassed by his wealth, by the obscene excess he'd accumulated while people struggled to find clean shirts for their children. A woman in her 50s approached, recognition dawning on her face. "Mr. Vale? I'm Patricia Chen, the operations director. We weren't expecting you." Unscheduled visit. Ethan extended his hand, falling into business mode because it was the only social script he knew. "I need to access the donation database, specifically records from March 2022, items logged under my account." Patricia's professional smile flickered with something uncertain. "Of course, but may I ask why? How did you explain this without sounding deranged?" Ethan glanced at Leon, who'd wandered toward a shelf of children's books and was running his fingers along the spines like reading Braille. "Some items I donated ended up with someone who needed them in ways I didn't anticipate. I want to understand the full distribution pattern." Vague enough to be meaningless, specific enough to sound legitimate. Patricia nodded slowly, still confused but unwilling to challenge a major donor. "This way." She led them to a back office where computers hummed and filing cabinets held years of carefully tracked generosity. The system Maya had designed was meticulous, every donation photographed, cataloged, assigned a tracking number, its journey from donor to recipient documented for tax purposes and operational efficiency. Patricia pulled up the database, entered credentials, and stepped back. "March 2022. Your account shows 17 boxes received on March 14th. I remember that day, actually. We'd never processed that much from a single donor at once." Ethan's throat tightened. March 14th. 3 days after the second anniversary of Maya's death. The weekend he'd finally admitted he couldn't live surrounded by her belongings anymore. The screen filled with entries of hundreds of items, each with a description, a photo, a destination. Maya's medical textbooks had gone to nursing students, her clothes to women's shelters. Her piano had been claimed by a school whose music program was underfunded. And their entry, 247, a wooden flute, Yamaha professional model, with a note. Minor wear, fully functional. Ethan's finger trembled as he clicked the entry. Destination, General Inventory Pool, distributed 3/28/2022 to recipient number 4782. He clicked again. Recipient number 4782, Tessa Rivers, household of 2, approved for musical instruments and children's items. The room tilted. Tessa, Isla's mother. The woman whose phone number was still inked on his palm. And this one? Ethan pulled up entry 248. Children's stuffed bear, brown, missing one eye, sentimental value. Same distribution date. Same recipient number. Both items had gone to Tessa Rivers in the same delivery batch, 2 pieces of Maya's life packaged together and sent to a stranger whose daughter would somehow end up on the same transatlantic flight where Leon needed them most. Mr. Vale? Patricia leaned closer, concerned. Are you all right? Ethan couldn't answer, couldn't process. The odds were breaking mathematics. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. It was designed so intricately it required either divine intervention or a conspiracy theory involving airline scheduling and donation center logistics. Leon appeared at his side, Bear dragging behind him, and looked at the computer screen like it was showing cartoons. See? Mama sent them. Patricia glanced between father and son, utterly lost. I'm sorry, I don't understand what… These items belong to my late wife. Ethan's voice came out mechanical. They ended up with a child who used them to help my son during a crisis. I'm trying to understand how. Patricia's expression shifted to something gentler. I remember your wife, Mr. Vale. She was extraordinary. When she designed this system, she insisted on one specific protocol. Items with emotional significance should be bundled together when possible. She said objects carry relationships, and separating them felt like breaking bonds that shouldn't be broken. The words landed like hammer blows. Maya had built relationship preservation into the distribution algorithm. She'd created a system that kept connected items together, ensuring that her flute and Leon's childhood bear wouldn't be scattered to different corners of the city, but would travel as a pair, maintaining their invisible thread. She'd designed her own posthumous intervention without knowing she was doing it. Ethan's legs gave out. He dropped into Patricia's desk chair, head in his hands, trying to process revelation piling on top of revelation, until the architecture of his understanding collapsed entirely. Mr. Vale. I need a minute. He heard himself say it from very far away. Leon's small hand found his shoulder, offering comfort the way children did when adults broke down, awkward and sincere and heartbreakingly pure. Maya hadn't sent a message. She'd built a system that would inevitably send messages, distributing pieces of herself throughout the community with the faith that they'd find their way to whoever needed them when the time came. She'd turned charity into prophecy, donation into destiny. And Ethan, who'd spent 3 years believing death was a wall that blocked all communication, had been living inside his wife's continued presence the entire time without recognizing it. The foundation wasn't just her legacy, it was her language. Every item redistributed was a sentence. Every family helped was a paragraph. And the story she was telling had a single theme. Love continues. Watch for it. Trust it. Let it work. He looked up at Patricia through blurred vision. Show me everything. Every item from those 17 boxes. Where they went. Who received them. I need to see the whole map. Because if Maya's flute and Leon's bear had found their way back through impossible channels, what else had she set in motion? What other families were walking around with fragments of her life, unaware they were carrying pieces of a larger design? Patricia hesitated, then nodded. This might take a while. I have time. Ethan pulled Leon onto his lap, holding his son close while the computer loaded entry after entry, building a constellation of connections that looked increasingly like intentional architecture. Maya Vale had died 3 years ago, but she'd apparently never stopped building bridges between the broken and the healing. And her husband was only just beginning to learn how to cross them. 6 months passed like pages turning in a book Ethan hadn't known he was reading, each chapter revealing that his wife's death had been an ending only in the most technical sense. The press conference filled the grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel with 200 journalists, cameras multiplying like surveillance eyes, microphones clustered on the podium like mechanical flowers waiting to consume whatever truth Ethan was about to speak. He'd held dozens of press conferences before, announcing mergers and acquisitions, defending quarterly earnings, projecting confidence so practiced it had become indistinguishable from genuine emotion. This was different. This required a kind of vulnerability he'd spent his entire adult life avoiding. Leon sat in the front row beside Patricia Chen, the teddy bear positioned on his lap with ceremonial precision. His son had changed in 6 months, not cured. Autism didn't work that way, but opened somehow, like a door that had been locked from the inside had finally admitted the possibility of visitors. He made eye contact more frequently now, spoke in longer sentences, still struggled with crowds and transitions, but the terror had diminished, replaced by something closer to cautious curiosity. The bear went everywhere with him. Ethan had tried once to wash it. The thing had accumulated months of handling and was developing concerning smells, but Leon had melted down so completely that Ethan surrendered. Some objects became extensions of self, and cleaning them felt like erasure. The bear stayed dirty, stayed loved, stayed essential. 3 rows behind Leon, Tessa and Isla Rivers occupied seats Ethan had reserved personally. They'd spoken 7 times since that morning at the airport, conversations that started as practical discussions about the flute's history and gradually transformed into something deeper. Shared grief, parallel losses, the strange recognition that occurred when 2 people realized they'd been speaking the same language in different dialects. Tessa's husband had died 4 years ago. Cancer that arrived fast and metastasized faster, leaving her with a 7-year-old daughter and medical debt that would take decades to clear. She worked doubles at a diner, took night classes toward a nursing degree she might finish before Isla graduated high school, and somehow still found energy to raise a child who saw patterns in the world that looked like prophecy. Isla had kept the flute. Ethan had offered to buy it back at any price, he'd said, desperate to reclaim this piece of Maya, but the girl had refused with the kind of gentle firmness that made the argument feel cruel. "It likes where it is," she'd explained, "and I still have songs to learn from it." So Ethan had let it go. Again. Differently this time. Not with the desperate disposal of grief, but with the intentional release of someone learning that love didn't require possession. The room quieted as Ethan approached the podium. Flashbulbs erupted, a lightning storm of documentation, everyone wanting to capture the moment when the notoriously private billionaire did something inexplicably public and emotional. He cleared his throat, gripped the podium edges to stop his hands from shaking, and began. 3 years ago, my wife Maya died unexpectedly, leaving me with a 7-year-old son whose autism made grief even more complicated than it already was. I responded the way many people respond to unbearable loss. I tried to erase the evidence. I donated 17 boxes of her belongings, removed her presence from our home, convinced myself that moving forward required leaving everything behind. His voice cracked on the last word, but he pushed through. Weakness was the point now. Vulnerability was the message. 6 months ago, on a transatlantic flight, my son had a severe meltdown. Nothing I did helped. I was powerless, watching him suffer, surrounded by strangers who thought I couldn't control my own child. Then, a little girl I'd never met approached with a wooden flute and a teddy bear. Items that had belonged to my wife, items I'd donated years earlier, and she played a lullaby my wife had composed. My son stopped crying immediately. For the first time in months, he experienced peace. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Journalists exchanged glances, trying to determine if this was legitimate news or eccentric grief talking. Ethan didn't care. He'd stopped caring about perception somewhere around the fourth revelation that his understanding of reality was fundamentally incomplete. I spent the following months investigating how those specific items ended up with that specific child on that specific flight. The statistical probability approaches impossibility. But it happened. And it happened because my wife had designed a donation distribution system that kept emotionally connected objects together. She'd built relationship preservation into charity logistics because she believed. His throat closed, but he forced words through. She believed that love was a network, not a possession, and that it continued working even after individual nodes went offline. Silence now. Complete attention. Even the most cynical journalists seemed caught by something in Ethan's delivery. Raw truth, maybe. Or the spectacle of watching a powerful man admit he'd been catastrophically wrong about something fundamental. Today, I'm announcing the Sky Lullaby Project. Ethan gestured to the screen behind him, where Maya's photo appeared laughing, radiant, pregnant with Leon, captured in a moment when the future had seemed guaranteed. Named after my wife's composition, this initiative will expand the distribution model she created. We're establishing programs in 50 cities to help families affected by autism access music therapy, grief counseling, and community support systems. But more than that, we're creating a registry. He clicked to the next slide, showing a database interface. When someone donates items of emotional significance, instruments, photographs, journals, anything that carries relationship memory, we'll track where those items go. We'll build a network that allows objects to maintain their connections to the people they originally belonged to. Because sometimes, his voice broke completely now, tears he'd been holding for 6 months finally escaping. Sometimes love needs help finding its way back. Sometimes it needs infrastructure. The room had gone completely still. Cameras captured his breakdown in real time, but Ethan had surrendered his fear of being seen. This was the most important business presentation of his life, and it had nothing to do with profit margins. My wife is dead. That's a fact. But the system she created continues mothering my son. The objects she touched continue healing strangers. The melodies she composed continue calming minds that language can't reach. So, maybe death isn't the end I thought it was. Maybe it's just a transformation of platform from body to legacy, from presence to pattern, from individual to network effect. He looked directly at Isla, who sat watching with those ancient eyes that had recognized what he couldn't see. A 7-year-old girl taught me that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just changes delivery systems. And if we build the right infrastructure, if we create intentional channels for connection, instead of assuming grief requires erasure, maybe we can all stay in contact with the people we've lost, not through mysticism or wishful thinking, but through carefully designed systems that treat relationships as something that survives individual mortality. Ethan stepped back from the podium, wiped his eyes unselfconsciously, and said the words he'd never spoken in any business context. I don't have all the answers. I'm still figuring this out. But I know my wife left me instructions encoded in charity logistics, and I'm finally smart enough to follow them. Thank you. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then, someone started clapping Patricia, standing in the back, tears streaming down her face. Then Tessa joined her. Then Isla, small hands making sounds too quiet to carry, but essential anyway. Then the entire room erupted, journalists abandoning objectivity, everyone recognizing they'd witnessed something that transcended typical news cycles. Ethan descended from the stage, walked directly to Leon, and lifted his son into his arms. The bear pressed between them, worn and dirt-stained, and absolutely perfect. "Did Mama see?" Leon whispered against his father's neck. Ethan looked at the screen where Maya's photo still glowed, her smile unchanged by death, her joy preserved in pixels. "Yeah, buddy, she saw. She's been seeing me all along." And for the first time in 3 years, Ethan Vale believed it completely. 10 years felt like both a lifetime and a single heartbeat, depending on which direction you measured from. The concert hall glowed with the kind of quiet anticipation that preceded something sacred. 2,000 seats filled with people who'd traveled from across the country for this specific evening. The stage sat empty except for a single piano, its black lacquer surface reflecting overhead lights like still water waiting to be disturbed. Backstage, 17-year-old Leon Vale adjusted his bow tie with fingers that had finally learned fine motor control after years of occupational therapy. His autism hadn't disappeared. Neurology didn't work that way, but it had transformed from a wall separating him from the world into a lens that let him see patterns others missed. He still struggled with crowds and unexpected changes, still needed noise-canceling headphones on subway rides, still carried the teddy bear in his backpack, even though he was too old for stuffed animals by conventional standards. But he could play piano, could translate the mathematical relationships between notes into physical movement so fluid it looked like his hands were having conversations with the keys. Music had become his primary language, more articulate than speech ever managed, and tonight he would speak to 2,000 people using his mother's vocabulary. Ethan watched his son from the wings, gray threading through his temples now, lines carved deeper around his eyes from a decade of learning that control was an illusion and surrender was the only honest response to love. The Sky Lullaby project had expanded beyond anything he'd imagined. 70 cities, 14 countries. Thousands of families connected through donated objects that carried relationship memory forward like relay runners passing torches through time. The registry had produced miracles monthly. A widow's wedding ring finding its way to her granddaughter during a divorce. A father's guitar reaching a teenager who'd never met him but shared his musical gift. A soldier's journal landing with the veteran who'd served beside him, decades after both had stopped talking about the war. Maya's system had proven scalable, repeatable, and utterly unable to be dismissed as coincidence anymore. Scientists had tried to study it with researchers from universities, publishing papers about pattern recognition in grief networks and emergent properties of emotionally weighted distribution systems. But their explanations always felt insufficient, like describing a sunset by measuring wavelengths instead of acknowledging that sometimes beauty operated beyond data. Isla Rivers stood beside Ethan, 27 now, finishing her doctorate in music therapy while working at the foundation her childhood intuition had helped create. She'd grown into her ancient eyes, her face finally matching the wisdom it had always contained. The wooden flute hung from a cord around her neck. She never went anywhere without it, claiming it still taught her songs she didn't know she needed until the exact moment they became essential. "He's nervous," she observed, watching Leon pace. "He's always nervous before performances," Ethan replied. "But he's learned to use it, channel it into intensity. Like his mother." Ethan smiled. Isla had never met Maya, but she spoke about her with the familiarity of someone who'd studied a life so thoroughly it became a kind of relationship. In some ways, Isla knew Maya better than Ethan did, had spent years interviewing the hundreds of people who'd received her donated belongings, documenting how each object had impacted its recipient, building a portrait of a woman through the distributed fragments of her existence. The lights dimmed, the audience quieted. A voice over the intercom announced, "Tonight marks the 10th anniversary of the Sky Lullaby Project. We're honored to present Leon Vale performing his mother's composition, Lullaby for Sky," followed by his own original work. Ethan's chest tightened. He'd heard Leon practice for months, knew every note by heart, but watching his son walk onto that stage confident despite his anxiety, purposeful despite his differences, felt like witnessing resurrection. This was the child who'd screamed for 90 minutes on a plane, who couldn't be consoled, who seemed trapped in a prison of his own neurology. And now he was choosing to stand before thousands of people and translate emotion into sound. Leon sat at the piano, adjusted the bench with his characteristic precision, placed his hands on the keys. The audience held its breath. Even the air conditioning seemed too quiet, unwilling to compete with what was about to happen. The first notes emerged exactly as Maya had written them, that ascending line that curved back on itself, the gentle complexity that sounded simple but required profound understanding to execute properly. Leon played with technical perfection, but also with something beyond technique, emotional archaeology, excavating his mother's intention from sheet music and memory, and the mysterious channels through which dead people apparently continued speaking if you built the right instruments to hear them. Ethan closed his eyes, and for a moment he was back on that plane, listening to Isla play this same melody on Maya's flute, watching impossibility unfold in real time. 10 years hadn't made it less miraculous. If anything, distance had clarified the magnitude that his wife had encoded her love into objects and systems and distribution networks that would continue functioning long after her body stopped, ensuring that her son would never truly be motherless. The lullaby concluded. Silence hung for 3 heartbeats before applause erupted, not polite appreciation, but the kind of ovation that acknowledged something transcendent had just occurred. People were crying. Ethan could hear it even from backstage, that particular acoustic signature of collective emotional release. But Leon wasn't finished. He waited for quiet, then transitioned into his original composition, Variations on Sky, a piece he'd been developing for 3 years that took his mother's melody and expanded it, reimagined it, and built new architecture on her foundation. The music became a conversation between past and present, between what Maya had created and what Leon was creating from it, between inheritance and innovation. This was how love continued, not through preservation or repetition, but through transformation. Leon wasn't just playing his mother's song, he was showing that her notes could generate new notes, that her melody could spawn infinite variations, that death ended the composer, but not the composition. Halfway through the piece, something extraordinary happened. A child in the 3rd row, maybe 6 years old, pulled a small recorder from her backpack and started playing along. The notes were approximate, the timing imperfect, but the intention was unmistakable. She'd heard beauty and wanted to join it. Her mother tried to stop her, embarrassed, but the child's quiet melody had already been noticed. Another child 2 rows back pulled out a harmonica. Then an adult with a violin. Then someone hummed. Within 30 seconds, 50 people in the audience had become an unwitting orchestra, all of them improvising around Leon's framework, creating something that had never existed before and would never exist again. Leon heard it. Ethan watched his son's face transform from concentration to joy, recognizing that his music had just stopped being a performance and became an invitation. He adapted his playing, left space for the other instruments, and turned solo into a symphony. Isla laughed beside Ethan, delighted and unsurprised. "Maya's still conducting," she said. "Look at what she built, a system that turns strangers into family and silence into song." The music swelled, amateur and professional blending into something that transcended technical skill and became pure collaborative joy. This was what the foundation had always been about: creating infrastructure for connection, building channels through which love could flow after individual hearts stopped pumping. When the final note faded, the silence that followed felt holy. Then someone stood, an older woman in the back, and said loudly enough to carry, "Thank you for remembering her." Others stood, more voices. "Thank you for showing us. Thank you for building this. Thank you for proving it continues." The audience was thanking Leon, but they were also thanking Maya, and thanking each other, and thanking whatever force in the universe allowed dead people to keep working through donated flutes and carefully designed distribution systems, and the mysterious fact that objects apparently carried memory forward, like DNA transmitting genetic code. Leon stood, bowed with the slight awkwardness that would always characterize his physical movement, and saw his father in the wings. Their eyes met. No words necessary. They'd both just witnessed proof that the last 10 years hadn't been delusion or wishful thinking, but accurate perception of how reality actually operated when you paid attention to the right variables. Ethan walked onto the stage, wrapped his arms around his son, and whispered, "She's so proud of you." "I know," Leon replied. "I hear her every time I play." The audience filed out slowly, reluctant to leave, wanting to extend this moment where death had been temporarily overruled by music and memory and the stubborn insistence that love was stronger than endings. Isla joined Ethan and Leon on stage, the three of them standing together in the space where impossibility had just been made routine. "What now?" Isla asked. Ethan looked at his son, who clutched the teddy bear retrieved from his backpack. Who'd grown from broken to brilliant without ever stopping being himself. "Now we keep building, keep creating channels, keep proving that the people we love never actually leave, they just change how they reach us." Leon nodded, then said something that would become the Foundation's new motto. "Love doesn't end, it just finds new hands to carry it." The lights dimmed as they left the stage, but the melody continued in the minds of everyone who'd heard it, replicating through memory and eventually through performance as those audience members taught it to their children, who would teach it to theirs. An infinite relay race where Maya Vale's lullaby would be passed forward through generations who never knew her name but carried her love anyway. Because that's what love did when you built the right systems. It survived. It spread. It continued, finding exactly who needed it, exactly when they needed it most. And somewhere in donated objects and distributed instruments and the mysterious mathematics of grief transformed into gift. Maya was still mothering, still teaching, still proving that death was just a change in format, not an ending. The concert hall went dark, but the song played on forever. If you enjoyed this story, drop a comment telling me what shocked you most, and subscribe to my channel. Make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for my next shocking story coming your way daily. Thanks for watching, and remain blessed.